COVID-19 world, BMI Tampa would like to, as we all adapt to a COVID-19 world, BMI Tampa would like to thank our chapter sponsors for their ongoing support of manager education.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar, and thank you to our chapter supporters for making these webinars possible. Before we start our CE course, one of our chapter sponsors, Krista Morlock with Concrete Painting and Restoration, has joined us, and she has, I believe, Miss Krista has a giveaway.
Yes, hello everybody. I miss seeing everybody. Hopefully we'll be back in person here soon. Since everybody has their Halloween stuff out now, I have a glow-in-the-dark nightmare, what is it? Nightmare Before Christmas. And of course, a big bowl of candy to go with him. And if you're far away and I can't deliver it to you, I'll give you an e-card to Amazon. So welcome, everybody.
Thank you. You want to tell us a little bit about your services?
Well, I hope everybody knows this by now, but if you don't, CPR stands for Concrete Painting and Restoration. We have a GC license. Other than painting, we do concrete restoration, wood restoration. We do parking garages, stairwells, walkways that are attached to the building. About anything and everything to do with buildings we can help you out with.
Great. Well, thank you so much for supporting the chapter, supporting manager education. And you guys, if you want to reach out to Krista, you can always go to our website under our member directory, or you can contact me directly and I'll get you her contact information. Thank you, Krista, for joining us.
You're welcome.
And with that, we'll turn the floor over to our presenters today, Stephen Mezer and Carlyn Meadows with Becker and Poliakoff. Thank you guys for joining us. I'm going to put myself on mute so I do not disturb you and let you just go from here.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Hopefully you've got the screen share, the budget and reserves. Are you seeing that, everybody? Can I get a yes? Good. Okay. Good morning again. Budgets and reserves. Everybody says, gee, it's that time of year, time to do the budgeting, and here we are. Got to tell you, I think budgeting now has become an everyday, all year obligation of boards and management because things change so unpredictably as we, endure the COVID issues as the, central issue today, but who knows what it'll be tomorrow. And all of these kinds of issues will have an impact on the budgeting. So with that admonition that we plan for budgeting year round, let's start with some basics. The budget workshop. A budget workshop it's a pretty traditional thing. You know, the budget committee will either meet by itself and hopefully with management, because typically the CAMs know far more about budgeting than the volunteers do. But, you know, each property is different, and sometimes they want to meet by themselves and try to figure out what they're going to present. Keep in mind that that budget committee is in fact, particularly in a condominium, it's recognized to be equal to the board. So if it meets, you have to do the 14-day notice, and it is open to the owners, and they have a right to attend, and they have a right to speak on the agenda items. So be careful with that. Particularly if you decide that you want to deal with some things that are more sensitive, like salaries and things that may not be favorable to the public participation, where owners are going to have all kinds of comment that may be inappropriate, particularly where you're talking about salaries. As far as the reserve component goes, the budget proposed must have the fully funded budget as a component. Whether you fully fund or not, you must show what that is. In most communities, we see them using some type of a reserve study. There are obviously businesses that will provide you with a reserve study. I wish I was in a room full of CAMs right now, because I would ask you to give me a show of hands. Has anybody ever seen a 100% accurate reserve study? And I don't think we'll find any. But they're good. I mean, they help protect you, the CAM, they protect the board, and they give them something to work with, as opposed to someone's estimate or guesstimate based upon what they did up north, or what another building did, or what they did 6 years ago. So having that reserve study is helpful. It's not currently required by law, but it does provide you with a baseline figure to use to justify it in case those reserves come up short in the future. But it must be shown to be fully funded, whatever that is. So we have the components of the budget. If you look in 718, it will refer you to 718.504, subsection 21, and that gives you the sections, the breakout for the budget. I've seen people micromanage their budget, and I've seen people generalize their budget. It's best just to comply with the law and have the statutory components. Kind of a fun fact, if you look at chapter 718, the word budget appears 52 times. If you look in 720, it only appears 30. So almost, well, 22 more times in 718. But the point is that each statute in 720, it's 720.303 subsection 6, tells you how to do the budget. In the Condominium Act, it's in 718.112, and you're going to find the components listed in 718.504.21. You've got insurance, management fees, employees, utilities. I'll stop on the utilities for a moment. Obviously, you can contact the utilities. Typically in October, they will be able to tell you what their projected increases will be for the following year. Same with the cable television companies, depending on your contract and so forth. I'll go back up to the employees. In this time of unemployment being so high, employees may be looking for the next highest proposal. So you do want to make sure that your employees are being paid at market rates so that they don't leave you in the following year, or you then have to up your allocation for those employees to be market. So it's a good time to check on that and make sure that you have them in line. Maintenance, you want to look for your future projects. Maybe you're doing some concrete work and some painting, and you'll talk to some folks about that as well. It's a great time to look at your contracts. Do you have contracts that are going to be expiring next year? Is there a contract providing an increase in the cost of that service, or is there another expense that may be coming in the upcoming budget year? And then we get to the budget line item for office expenses. Does the association provide the materials? Are you properly budgeting for those expenses as they will be incurred in the future, particularly if you have other things coming up in, say, 2021 that didn't occur this year? Will those office expenses increase? Maybe you will be doing more mailings or something else of that nature. More on the reserves. The reserves generally are a common expense. The calculation is done by statute, and you all have lived this. The estimated cost for the replacement, the estimated remaining useful life, and what was the total lifespan for the particular item. And we typically see, say, painting for 7 years, and then we have to figure out how many more years we have remaining in that particular component. If the association is responsible for limited common elements, it has to budget for those. When we get to the limited common elements, check your documents. Again, particularly in the condominium, the limited common element may be expensed to the unit owner who has the exclusive use of that limited common element. That owner may also be responsible for the maintenance and repair for that at his or her expense. And you just have to look. There are at least 3 different possible combinations on how that works. You want to make sure that you've budgeted it correctly. One of them, for example, may include assessing the owner and you administer the funds. Acceleration is really very helpful at the beginning of the year, not so helpful later on, but do look for a provision on acceleration. It may be in the bylaws. More often we'll see it in the declaration, but don't forget to look in the bylaws for acceleration. What is that? That's declaring a delinquent owner's assessments are due for the rest of the budget year. So that if somebody has not paid, say, January and February, you can accelerate the rest of 2021 and say it's now all due. It can go into the claim of lien if it goes that far. And that way you don't have to deal with that same owner later on in the year. If you have a multi-condominium, be careful. You want to make sure that you budget correctly in line with the allocation. What are the shared expenses? Typically, it may be a recreation facility or an amenity of some kind, or they have their separate expenses, such as their grounds maintenance, individual building expenses that are unique to a particular condominium. Be careful when you get to things like insurance policies. Find out where the allocation is for insurance premiums and deductibles so that you've budgeted accordingly for them. Now, adopting the budget. Most of you will probably say, well, of course, the board adopts the budget. That is, by all means, the most common provision that we see, and the statutes are kind of skewed in that direction, but both the Condominium Act and the Homeowners Association chapter do recognize that budgets may be adopted and approved by the membership. I've seen people have their budget put before the membership for no good reason, other than that's the way they've always done it. And I've seen people fail to do that when it's required by their documents. I am not a fan of that. It is entirely legal. If that's the way the community wants to do it, by all means, they can do it. The problem comes in when the members do not approve the budget and you have this, carryover from last year's budget or no budget or some other method of adopting a budget. It gets to be quite cumbersome, and in the end, the result is probably pretty darn close to what it would have been originally. Statutory requirements and bylaw requirements. I gave you some of the statutory requirements, the 718, 504, 21 list. But your bylaws may have additional requirements. It's time to dust those things off and look at them. Again, don't use last year's budget and say, well, that must have been right. They had a great CAM then, and now I'm doing it, and I'm going to learn from the best. No, no, no. Don't assume that they've always done it correctly, whether it was under developer control or whatever it was. Even if you did it last year, please check your work, go back and look at those bylaw requirements. The 115% rule, oh, that's part of the urban legend. How many meetings have we been to where somebody says, well, we can't increase the budget more than 115% or shorthand 15% because the statute prohibits that? Wrong. That 115% rule, and it is in both condo and HOA, says that if you increase the assessments more than 115% of what they were the prior year, and there's a way of calculating that. It excludes increases in reserves and one-time expenses. So if it increases more than 15% shorthand, the members have a right to propose an alternative budget. All right, again, show of hands. Has anybody ever seen this done? Nope, no hands go up. Good. Yeah, I haven't either. I've seen people come close to maybe thinking potentially and possibly about it. But when the owners realize that they have to propose at least a lawful budget and that they need a quorum of the members to approve it, the whole concept goes by the wayside. And if we think about the primary obligation of the board is to adopt a lawful budget, that means that you have to include all of the anticipated expenses and all of the anticipated revenues. So given the fact that you're usually a not-for-profit entity and you have no other real sources of income, it's all right there. And your expenses are pretty well defined and they're not really up to much adjustment and gamesmanship, as it were. But for the reserves, where you can have the owners vote to less than fully fund those reserves. The budget process, again, both statutes require some type of a mailing to the owners, and so you need the affidavit of mailing and keep minutes for that. A lot of details in the statutes, and Carlyn is going to come in at the end of this and tell you why this is all important, so stand by for that part of it. Let's move to the reserves. We see the straight line reserve calculations. Those of us who have been doing this more than 20 years know that straight line reserves was the traditional method. Cash flow reserves is also known as pooled reserves. And it's really become quite popular here in the Tampa Bay area. People to go to pooled reserves. It is, for most of us, not exactly rewarding. It hasn't quite lived up to its billing yet. Maybe there's some time. This was created by a CPA in the DBPR who originally said that in order to do a pooled reserve, you need to do projections out at least 20 years so that your cash flow through the reserve account never hits zero. So you might have a roofing project and a paving project and a painting project, and you project out your needs over 20 years, and you have cash flow reserves or pooled reserves, and you can put various components of reserves into the pool, and you can do others straight line. The determination, for example, if we're going to go to pooled reserves for 2021, is made by the board of directors. The board prepares the budget for 2021 and says, we're going to go to pooled reserves. We're going to do the cash flow reserve analysis. For that, I would generally recommend using one of those reserve study companies to do it. And under today's standards, most of them are going out 30 years. Again, the original author was 20 years, but conceptually, we're probably looking out 30 years to make sure that happens. There was a skirmish with the DBPR last year, 2019, where they really didn't want you to adjust your pooled reserves year over year. I think that's a wrong decision. Given that these are political appointees, we may see a different position from the DBPR in the future. Go ahead and I'll give you some free legal advice. Go ahead and adjust it to be reality so that you do have full funding, so that if you put a painting project into the reserve pool and a roofing project, make sure that you get the full amount of those projects into the pool. So if you want to go to the pooled reserves, how do you convert straight line to cash? That's where I need a member's vote. I'm going to be taking those straight line, normal reserve funds, what I had in there for the roofing project, and I'm going to move it into the pool so there's more money in the pool, and it's going to make it possibly functional as a reserve account. Using reserves for other purposes, that also requires a vote of the membership. These votes are a majority of the owners at a meeting, not a majority of all owners, a majority who attend, provided that you have the quorum. That's why it's at a meeting. There's no meeting without a quorum, but it's a majority vote. Same thing for transferring money between reserve accounts. If you're using that straight line reserve and you need a little more money for the paint project, and you don't want a special assess and you don't want to borrow, we're going to just move it from the roofing reserve, but it takes a vote of the membership. There's also a horrible urban legend out there, and you just see it probably once or twice a year, but that's too often. We can borrow from reserves as long as we pay it back this month. No, you cannot. It is not a loan account. It's not there for other uses, absent a vote of the membership. If you come up short, maybe you have an unexpected expense, the insurance premium came in higher than you expected, and you need money, get the vote of the membership to take it from the reserves if that's what you're going to do. I will tell you that if the insurance premium came in today and it's due September 10th. Today's the 1st of September. You have only 10 days to get that premium in. Yeah, take it from the reserves, as between not getting the vote of the membership and not having insurance. I would rather that you have insurance. Again, it's a unlawful act in either case, taking that reserve money and using it for a different purpose, but the state will give you a pass on that. We've done that a few times already, unfortunately, had to do that. Do make sure that you account for the reserve interest. Obviously, these days, that's not a lot of money, but it is money and it needs to be accounted for. And you can use it to fund that particular line item, so that if you have $500,000 in a particular account and you know that that's going to earn a certain rate of interest, you can project what that's going to be and use that to help fund that particular account. Don't just leave that to year-end accounting and moving it later. Go ahead and budget for it. It's one small way of keeping those assessments down. Waiving reserves. Okay, full waiver. Full waiver is to say we don't want any reserves at all, and that's a vote of the membership. The board is not obligated to do that. Sometimes you can get a partial waiver and say, we're going to fund it at, say, 80% in order to avoid telling the membership, we're going to get a waiver, and not tell them, what does that waiver mean? Well, if you waive it, we'll go down to 80%. That'll keep your assessments at a certain level while keeping the reserves funded at a certain level. You get that partial reserve waiver. Some of the communities, and I like this concept, particularly beachfront condos for some reason tend to have a lot of fluctuation in their expenses that are impacted in the reserve funding. For example, painting, roofing, paving as the typical three, they're exposed to weather, they're exposed to the salt air, they're exposed to all kinds of things that the reserve study may not consider. And given that, we think we're full funding, but weather happens or something else happens that might make that not fully funded. If I have the waiver in place, I'm protecting the board and management from a claim later on saying, well, gosh, when you did the 2021 budget, you told us it was fully funded, but reality came in and said it wasn't. So I'd go ahead and consider getting a waiver even if we are going to fully fund. HOA reserves. This one, you can thank the same gentleman who proposed the pooling concept. He's the one who started this reserves for HOAs and got that into the statutes. And in here, it is a complex mess, and the legislature has tried to fix it a couple of times, and it's still a mess. Mandatory reserves for an HOA. These are ones that are created by the developer or by the declaration. So the declaration might provide, or the developer may have provided, a roofing reserve. And say you're going to do a roof in the clubhouse, or we're going to do the townhomes, and we're going to have a reserve for the townhome roofs. That becomes a mandatory reserve, and the calculation is exactly the same as it is for the condominium by way of the replacement value, the estimated remaining useful life, and where are we today in that life cycle? What would be the cost projected, several years from now when that component will need to be replaced? We also have what we put in quotes, the board adopted reserves. We didn't have a reserve for paving, but we sure do now because the board created one. Once you have one of these reserves, whether it's the mandatory or the board adopted reserve, you must continue with it until the membership votes otherwise. They may find that, gosh, we've changed the responsibility for the roofs to be the homeowners, so they no longer need a roof reserve, or the roads have been taken over by the CDD, so we don't need to have a road reserve, or they become county roads, or somebody put in a road reserve and they are county roads. People do that kind of thing in the planning where the original developer thought that they would be private roads and turned out that they were public roads, so we have to get rid of a reserve. Using the reserve funds for other purposes, that is the same thing. It's a vote of the owners. If you find that the reserve account is an attractive way of financing something, yeah, I still need to have the membership vote on that. I can't just do it. It is not a bank account. We're going to move over to Carlyn for the collection of assessments. And she's going to tie this into what I've been talking about for the last 30 minutes. Carlyn?
Absolutely. Hello. I've been with Becker for 2 years. Actually, today is my 2-year anniversary, and I focus on collections of unpaid assessments, regular assessments, and special assessments. And as you all are familiar with, the statute requires specific steps be taken whenever someone has failed to pay their assessments timely. There are specific notices that are required to be sent out. But before you ever get to that step, what's the most important basis or the foundation for being able to collect those assessments under any circumstances really begins with the budget. And as Steve said, the budget is a year-long process, and creating the foundation for your assessments to be collectible is almost a day-to-day process. And to tie it into our topic today about budgets, one of the most important components is the notice of the meetings leading up to the budget discussion, and the maintaining the records that are associated with that notice process. The affidavit of mailing regarding your meeting, the meeting minutes, everything that goes into setting up that budget meeting and properly adopting the budget is going to be your foundation for the collectability of those assessments. As we all know, the collectability of assessments is an authority granted by statute in the governing documents of the association. And so therefore, a valid budget means valid assessments. But as we all know, disputes still arise, and people still refuse to pay their assessments. And there are generally two ways that are effective in disputing the responsibility or the duty to pay the assessments. And that is basically being able to show that the homeowner paid it, or it's not a lawfully imposed assessment. The courts have basically generally said that there are two things that an association has to show, and that is that the owner holds title to the property at the time that the assessment was levied, and that the assessment conforms to the declaration and the bylaws of the association. So going back to preparation of the budget and notice of the budget, as long as the association has that foundation and has properly noticed their budget and properly adopted the budget, makes the collection of the assessments that much smoother and easier to show if someone chooses to not pay and it becomes a court case. There are several litigation cases that are supportive of this issue. The most important one, or the most significant one, is Berg versus Bridle Path Homeowners Association. This case is important because it stands for the premise that the association has the burden to establish that it complied with the recorded covenants and the bylaws imposed by imposing the assessments and the liens. And in order to prevail, an association has to, is obligated to show that it's properly levied the assessments in accordance with the community's declaration and the bylaws. So this is probably the most significant case in that regard, disputing the argument that the homeowner could make that the assessment is not lawfully imposed. Some defenses that homeowners tend to bring up that are not valid defenses to non-payment, the association's failure to maintain the common elements, an owner's disagreement with a line item or a particular budget item that the board of directors has determined should be a part of the budget, and the owner's claim that the board breached a fiduciary duty. That is not a defense to non-payment of assessments. So again, going back to the budget process, that's going to be your foundation as far as creating a enforceable assessments and enforcing the association's ability to collect those assessments. So as Steve has said, all of the steps leading up to adopting the budget are very critical in the collectability of those assessments. Steve, would you like to add anything to that?
Only that when you have a law firm that you're working with, if you're having them do the collections, it's probably also important that they're involved in the budget process, even if it's just a 5-minute review to make sure that the budget was done correctly. You know, a second set of eyes looking at the bylaws, looking at the particular statute, to make sure that when that law firm does the collection work, that they're comfortable with the budget process. There's nothing worse than having an account given to us or to any law firm for collection, and whether it's immediately upon receipt we see the error, or we're in trial and the opposing attorney brings out the smoking gun that shows that the budget was not correctly approved, we don't like that. So if we could make it right to begin with, all of us will be a lot happier and certainly a lot more effective when we can show compliance from the beginning. And I candidly, we see people who split these, and it'd be the same as if you as a CAM insert yourselves into the process mid-year, where you inherit a wrongfully approved budget and try collecting those assessments. There is extreme liability on your part and defenses on the part of the owners, and it's just not a pretty picture. Carolyn?
I would just add that, you know, if one owner is successful in challenging either the budget process or even the validity of the governing documents, the validity of the declaration, it's really a domino effect. It can be a domino effect. And if one homeowner is successful in that challenge, number one, other homeowners are going to find out about that. Number two, it opens up, you know, the examination of the assessments and the budget as a whole across the board for all owners. And so that can be, you know, pulling a thread on a sweater, and it can really become a significant financial blow to the association if in fact their assessments are uncollectible. So it's critically important to make sure that the budget is done properly in order to be able to collect those assessments and continue the function of the association. We have one association that we're working with now that went through a governing document revitalization, and there was an error made in the recording of that revitalized governing document, the declaration and bylaws. And now there's a question as to whether they are going to be able to collect assessments from any homeowners at this point. So we're working through that problem with them, but it goes to show that the significance in the detail and paying attention to the detail in the process in order to make those assessments valid and collectible.
Yeah, I don't necessarily, sorry, I don't, if I could interrupt, I don't necessarily agree with the case law on that, but the case law is very, very harsh where the preservation or revitalization was not done correctly. The most recent cases have said that the association cannot collect any assessments. I historically have been successful with judges in the Tampa Bay area convincing them that an owner still owes the reasonable value of the services provided, but I'm not sure that that would succeed under the current cases. So we can't underscore enough the need for documentation that the association is properly constituted and that its documents are legally enforceable and that the budget process is done correctly before you go trying to collect those assessments.
And Steve, I just want to let you know, we do have a question.
Okay.
The question is, do you know if there is a statute or law change to allow HOAs to charge both interest and late fees?
That statute has not changed, and that's more in your wheelhouse as to the collection process. You know, it's got the default provision so that if your documents are silent, you have the statutory interest rate, but you need to have a provision specifically allowing for the late fee. And that's pretty much the same in condo and HOA, the 18%, and it's the $25, the 1%. So you've got that.
Yeah, I agree with you, Steve. I think that it's very similar with HOAs as well as COAs. The default for interest does allow, as long as your governing documents state that you can collect interest, your governing documents don't have to state an amount. And if it doesn't state an amount, it'll default to the highest rate allowed by law, which is 18% right now. Late fees, like Steve said, you do specifically have to have a term in the governing documents allowing you to collect late fees. The maximum is 5% of the assessment amount or $25, whichever is greater. The mistakes I see with that are oftentimes associations will either charge late fees too many times. For example, you can only charge late fees the number of times that an assessment is due. So if your assessments come due on a quarterly basis, you can't charge late fees monthly. They courts have said an assessment is only late once, basically. So you can charge a late fee on a quarterly basis for quarterly assessments, annually for annual, and so on. So you have to be careful about that. I've also seen documents with too high a percentage. They allow for up to 10% or more of the assessment amount, and the statute caps that at 5% or $25, whichever is greater.
Yeah, I was just going off on the lender liability thing. Thank you, Carolyn. Yeah, it's interesting. You see a lot of the older documents will have a specific interest rate that may be as low as 6% or a very nominal late fee. If your documents have those provisions in them, you're bound by them. So if it says 6% interest or a $5 late fee, whatever it is, that's what you're stuck with unless you amend it out. So yeah, if you want the money, I would amend it out. If you're okay with those interest rates, and if that's the way we've always done things, there's nothing wrong with, you know, saying 6% interest or $5 late fee. But as Carolyn pointed out, it's by installment. So if you have quarterly, you can only charge it for that particular quarter, and then it is delinquent and you've gotten your late fee on it. And the interest rate is per annum, not per month, not per week. We've seen a lot of miscalculations there, and judges don't like that when you have miscalculations. So you do want to be very, very careful with that as well. Are there any other questions? I have one more issue to.
I don't see any open questions right now, Steve.
Yeah, if anybody has them, feel free to type them into the chat and we'll handle anything that you've got.
I think we did have one, I'm sorry, Steve, at the very beginning. I don't know if we can go back to that one, Carrie, if we, I think you emailed a question to us.
Oh, that's right. It was on the registration form. I can tell you what it is. I just have to open it up. Bear with me.
Okay. While Carrie is looking for it, I want to add one point on the reserves. I mean, everybody rattles it off just like I did. Painting, paving, roofing. And those are our reserve funds. And here's where I want you to think a little bit about what you're doing, particularly, we'll just use roof as an example. You know, what is a roof? And it may have flashing, soffit, fascia, wood underlayment, all kinds of neat little things up there that you roofing people know more about than I would. And you've got to wonder, did the roof reserve include those items or did it not? And a lot of times we see people doing reserve calculations and they go, well, it's so much a roofing square. We know how many squares we've got and how many years. And really, what are they talking about? Tiles and shingles and nothing else. And then when they go to do the roof project, they go, yeah, but we got soffit, fascia, lead boots, and all kinds of neat things to deal with. Oh yeah, that underlayment, that's so much per, you know, per sheet, or, you know, how much it's going to cost for yards of that stuff. And it's not in the roofing reserve. So when you do it, make sure that you identify exactly what you were thinking about when you funded that particular reserve, so that you have a really good chance of it actually being fully funded. Also, just because it says roof reserve on it doesn't mean that every time a roof issue comes up, you can dip into that roof reserve and say, well, that's the roof reserve. Let's just use it for that. For example, roof leaks, or we're going to, you know, just update a part of the roof. That may or may not make it. The roof leaks, definitely not, unless you put the money in there. And there's nothing wrong with doing that and saying, look, over the typical year, we're going to spend $2,000 on roof leaks. Let's just reserve for it. Perfectly fine, as long as you identify it that, in fact, there is a component of that roof reserve in my hypothetical that is for roof leaks. Otherwise, the general topic roof is not going to cover it. Carrie, did you find your question?
I sure did, and I wanted to say too really quickly on insurance. I would put in about 15% for insurance, unless, but I also recommend that each year you check with your insurance agent prior to, just to make sure. Honestly, guys, insurance agents really don't know what your rate increase is going to be till January 1st of the year that your policy renews. So it is hard for them to pinpoint that sometimes, but always check with your insurance agent.
Follow-up question here to our interest and late fees. Basically, she is asking for clarification. Just interest and late fees can both be charged, ? And the answer to that is yes, as long as the governing documents allow for both. Wouldn't you agree, Steve?
Yeah, and I wonder why people do not do both. There are people who don't. I get it. You know, it just seems harsh, and you know, maybe that's just a different view. But yes, you can. And just because we have a small group, we'll do a small addition to this. It is rare, but it is possible. It is stated in some documents that the board has the ability to waive or reduce reserves or late fees. But if it's not there, I question whether a board can do that. I think fiduciary duty probably says you should not do that. So you may want to just look at that on a case-by-case basis and see if the board has authority to waive or reduce interest and late fees.
Okay, I found a question, guys. It says, what is the recommended percentage of an HOA for being fully funded in their reserves?
There isn't a percentage, it's reality. And this is where that reserve study comes in. And if you don't want to spend the money for a reserve study, sorry, reserve study people, there are usually ways around that, but I would ask for estimates from independent professionals. And I know that a lot of them don't like, you know, giving an estimate. You know, the roof has 20 more years left on it, but you ask the roofer what would it cost to replace it. They know what you're doing, and they may charge you for it, and it's probably well worth it for you to get that estimate from the roofer. So there isn't a percentage. This is reality. I need to know what will it cost to replace that roof or paint the building or pave the roads, and project it out so that I have enough money in that particular reserve to fund all of it at the time that the project comes due. And you do want to adjust these calculations periodically. Some people do it every year, but certainly no more than 5 years apart, to say, let's take a real close look at those components to see how they're doing and to see how we're doing, so that you understand what reality is, reality based on what the condition of the building is or the particular reserve component, and what the costs are. Many of these reserves are oil-based products, and so if we're looking at, you know, painting the building or paving or roofing, and we're going to use oil-based products, I think we all know from, you know, reality is that those prices will change. Now, earlier I said that the pooling will require us to project out 20 to 30 years. I don't know what the price of gas is going to be on my way home tonight. So, you know, I knew what it was this morning when I passed this station, but on the way home, I can pretty well count on the price being different. So projecting out the cost of oil-based products, you know, years and years into the future, I think is quite a trick, but these folks will do it for you. And that's all the more reason why you want that independent evaluation. Even if you've been a CAM for 20 or 30 years and you've done numerous projects of the same kind, and you know what the going prices are, and you may have even come from that industry before you were a CAM, or you may have board members who are in that industry, I would still get the independent evaluation, even if it only supports your position. It's for your protection and for the protection of the board. Other questions?
I do have another question, Steve. It says, this does not pertain to the budget, but it does to collections. Can the association process a flat rate for demand letters to cover expenses? I'm not sure what they mean exactly, but what I think you may mean is, can a management company or an association charge for doing a demand letter? Can they put a fee on the homeowner's ledger, is what I take that to mean. And yes, we see that quite often for the initial, either for, maybe a nominal charge for, I see yes to cover expenses. I see a nominal charge for maybe courtesy late payment reminder letter, maybe some postage, and then it gets a little more expensive if associations do their own intent to lien notices to homeowners. But we see flat rates added to ledgers fairly frequently for the early on collections efforts. Steve, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd like to see that in the declaration. So it says that the delinquent owner is responsible for costs of collection, including, you can say, reasonable fees charged by the management company or something of that nature, so that it is contractually clear that it is a cost of collection. From there, I would also like to see it in the CAM's contract so that everybody understands that this charge will be imposed and who's going to get the money. And typically it may be straight to the CAM, and that's perfectly fine as long as it's by contract and it's disclosed. And if we're looking to collect it through the collection process that Carolyn was referring to, it should also be in the declaration.
Agreed. And Steve, she goes on to say, we are in an automated system now. It does it all for us. And so, yeah, I think, oh, I see, it's difficult to separate the postage. So yeah, you can charge, like Steve was saying, it's best to have that in your agreement, in your contract, so it's understood that that's going to be charged and who's going to get it. That makes it a lot easier to collect as well. But yes, I think the general question to your answer is yes, you can do that.
Any other questions, comments? Be happy to take them.
I think that's all the ones I have at the moment.
Okay. Carrie, we have what, 5 more minutes? Carrie comes back and unmutes herself. All right, I'll do it. Well, Carrie's
Well, I'm right here. I'm sorry.
There you are.
Yes.
I'm right here. I talk. I was just talking into my phone, but I was on mute, so it made no difference. You do have one more question come up, but I do want to remind everybody, if you have a question that you prefer that not everyone see who's asking the question, you can always do it privately via the chat as well. But I'll let you guys take this next question that's come up.
She's asking, we did an insurance appraisal and it was very good. So I'm not quite sure, Steve, if you have a reply or maybe a response. Oh, she said just a comment. Yeah. Insurance appraisals in general, is there anything that you wanted to address with that, Steve?
Yeah, obviously the insurance appraisals for a specific purpose, and depending on the content, and I agree with the comment made that they can be quite helpful. They can point out needs for maintenance, repair, replacement that may be not only reserve factors, but budget factors, so that if the insurance appraisal says that the roof of the building or the paint or the paving, whatever component it is less than average condition or is not well maintained or is in need of repair or replacement, that's really a good red flag. On the other hand, if it says that it's in excellent condition, then you can factor that in as well. This is a situation where more information is better than no information, and you're dealing with a variety of viewpoints and purposes. So yes, by all means, the insurance appraisal is quite helpful in this process and should and can be considered in the budget process and the reserve process as well for your documentation in case you're ever challenged. We have seen, for whatever reason, more and more people asking informed questions when they're buying. Is the budget fully funded for reserves? Do you have delinquents? And they're asking pointed questions. And if you're going to answer, yes, we're fully funded, and somebody is going to buy a property based on your representation as a CAM or your representation as a board, you want to have a basis for that. And if you have that documentation, then you can be a lot more comfortable than saying, we don't want to raise the assessments next year because they're going to fire us. If you can justify it and say, look, we've got it from the evaluation of the property, whether it was an insurance appraisal or it was a reserve study or an independent opinion, then you have a basis for it. And bringing the bad news may be a little bit easier to do when you've got the documentation, as opposed to, you know, you're the new management company, you inherited a bad property with a bad budget, and you go, my gosh, they didn't maintain things and they didn't fund things. Now I've got to come in and raise it for the next year. They're surely going to terminate my contract. But I think you make your case for it with documentation, not necessarily your experience. The documentation will back you up, and your experience will speak volumes to the members as well. And I see we have the survey up as well, and I see 5 of you have not yet responded. So if you would please answer the survey for Carrie. And with that, I think we're just about done. Yes.
Well, I wanted to, and just so you guys know, I'm a retired insurance agent, and I wanted to remind everybody that when it comes to these appraisals, many of you guys sign up for a 3 to 4 month term of insurance appraisals. I would always ask that question or look for somewhere on the appraisal where it states that they actually came out and did a physical visit of your property, because there have been times when people are signed up on these renewals that they're just generating documents updated on the latest values, and they don't go out and take a look at your property. And if you've had a change, like I even had it one time where they installed a pool midterm and the appraisal never picked it up. I caught it as the insurance agent. But if they had physically gone out there and inspected the property, which is what they should be doing as an insurance appraiser, then that would not have happened. So yes, they're supposed to dot their I's and cross their T's, but you can't always depend upon them to do that. So just be cautious of that, you guys.
And
Carrie,
there's
I'll join in on that. There's a company, and I'll tell you, it's out of Georgia. I won't get any more specific than that. They're out of Georgia, and they'll do a reserve study for you, a lot less expensive than the other guys, except they don't leave Georgia. And they're doing, I have one here on a Florida property, and they told us they used Google Earth and industry standards. And that's how they prepared the reserve study.
And you are doing yourself a huge misjustice if you're using something like that and not having somebody local visit your property from an insurance standpoint.
And from a reserve study and from a funding and budgeting purpose. It was ludicrous. The numbers were so far off because the community then had a real reserve study done, and they obviously had a large increase in their assessments.
And there's a comment here that may speak to a little bit of a different slant on the insurance estimates. She says they also received one for if a major storm occurs, and it gives a running list of components. So I don't know, Steve, if you want to speak to that issue.
Yeah, obviously the insurance replacement cost is a far different calculation, because let's see, if you had a roof that needed to be replaced, you know, midterm, as it were, you've got a 20-year tile roof, estimated remaining useful life, and the trees fall on it, and you need to replace the tile roof. The replacement cost today may be quite different than projected out for 20 years, and that will also recalibrate your calculation of the reserves for the future, so that if we do replace something using insurance funds, then we're going to have to adjust that later on. And that's pretty much the same for budgeting in general. As we sit here beginning of September, we should be able to figure out, are we going to have a surplus this year, or are we going to have a shortfall? And what are we going to do with it? How are we going to address it in next year's budget? Are we just going to roll those funds over and put them in reserves if we have a surplus? And if we end up with a shortfall, how are we going to pay for it? Hopefully it's not by not paying your bills. That's not a good way to end the year. Hopefully you end up with the bills paid. But this is something that you do have to plan for, the insurance claims, those replacement costs, and the impacts on things like COVID on your cash flow. Are you a community that has folks who are unemployed or may have other cash flow issues such that the assessment revenues may be impacted next year? What you've seen for the last few months probably will be a good indication. It's something that you may want to consider budgeting for, the non-paying owners to see how you can balance your budget as opposed to anticipating 100% collections.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Wow, this is very informative. Gail Denny just wanted to thank you guys for putting this seminar together. You're very welcome, Gail. She says she really enjoys them. I'm glad that someone does, Gail. And great team. So that's nice to hear. It's good to get those positive reviews every now and then. Again, I want to thank Steve and Carolyn for being with us today. And Steve, you might want to take your thing off of screen share now.
There you go.
I got to do a plug. I got to do a plug really quick while we're on here. BMI Tampa and great team. So that's nice. It's good to get those positive reviews every now and then. I don't know why I don't know what's going on with that. Steve and Carolyn for being. You guys hear that?
We did.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
It's when I do screen share. I don't know why it's doing that. But anyway, September 15th, we are coming back live. We're going to have an in-person luncheon, and Steve and Carolyn are going to present on how to properly run an election. You guys, on that particular course that you're going to be presenting, we're going to be discussing just the procedures of elections, but are we also going to be discussing electronic elections as well? How much do we delve into that?
Absolutely, yes. We'd like to.
Okay. And that'll be on 11:30 p.m. It is in Tampa. I'll be emailing out the flyers. If you guys have any questions regarding this course and you would like to ask anyone questions regarding the course, you can always email BMI, which is where you receive the link to the actual invitation, and I will make sure it gets to the proper party. I'll also be sending you a thank you email with the email address for Stephen and Carolyn, so you can reach them directly if you have questions you want to go directly to them with. One other thing that Carolyn is working on with a few other of our BMI associates is a self-dealing webinar, which is going to be really interesting because it's going to be touching on board members overstepping boundaries. Is that a good way of saying it, Caroline?
I think so. I think what we hope to do is to really bring to the forefront and to create better understanding as to some of the activities that people might think are harmless, which are actually considered self-dealing, and just to raise awareness of those things so that you don't fall into that pitfall. Steve, do you have any quick comments on self-dealing issues?
No, it's coming out in a variety of shapes and sizes, so it should be an interesting issue for us to look at.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if I've ever sat through a course on self-dealing where it's just been focused the 100% on that topic, and I think that so many board members need that because they just don't even, innocently they could be doing something and not even realize what they're doing.
Right, and that's what we hope to clarify.
All right, well, thank you guys so much for joining us. I want to thank again our sponsors, and we're going to do a drawing here for the people that attended this webinar live so that Krista can email them their gift. So thank you, CPR Concrete Painting and Restoration, for that. And with that being said,